Thanks. So each year, about 1.6 million children die of diarrhea. That's about 4,000. Sorry, that's about 4,000 per day. It's about 20% of all child mortality. Key cause of that is unsafe drinking water. And if you look at the Millennium Development Goals, the one quantifiable Millennium Development Goal that was agreed on by the world community was to reduce by half the proportion of people without sustainable access to safe drinking water. Here's a picture of some kids in Kenya collecting drinking water. This is from a naturally occurring spring. They scoop up the water into these plastic jerry cans, and bring it home, pour it into a drinking water container at home, and that's their drinking water supply. And you can imagine the runoff from the surrounding fields can get in that drinking water. And so you can get, sorry to bring this up after lunch, but you can get fecal contamination in there, and that can be deadly in these circumstances, and it is deadly. So the standard approach that a lot of development organizations have been focusing on is, let's build new water sources. Let's put in infrastructure. There's actually surprisingly little evidence on what's the health impact. We have reason to think this is something that should work. We know that it's microorganisms in water that cause diarrhea. So maybe you would say, look, this is a no-brainer. Of course you should invest in this. But given, I'm going to argue that it's important to actually test the assumptions and to not take things on faith that can be tested. So I was involved in something it's very similar to a medical trial, but it was in development. There were a couple of hundred springs in Kenya. There was a technology to do something called spring protection, which is to dig out that spring, put in a pipe, put in concrete. That way the water isn't as subject to contamination. It doesn't get it perfectly pure, but gets it much cleaner. I was working with an NGO that didn't have the resources to protect all these springs immediately. So they phased this in over several years. And we were able to, and they determined the order of phase-in randomly. So it was very much like a medical trial, as in that you were halfway through, you could look, and some of the springs were protected, some weren't. By comparing them, you could get at the impact of this. So we did this, and we found that child diarrhea fell about a quarter. Okay, you can work out the cost-benefit. It's decent. It costs about $1,000 to protect the spring. This is it's a pretty good health investment. But it turns out that the health benefits that we had assumed would be there weren't necessarily fully being realized. Why? The source water, if you tested the water at the source, you saw this quite, 2/3 fall in contamination levels in E. coli counts. If you went to people's houses and tested the water there, saw they only fell by about a quarter. What was happening? Well, people put the water in their container at home. When they need a drink of water, they scoop it out. Their hand gets in the water, it can get recontaminated. Okay? So this, there's a picture of a protected spring. Okay? So this worked, but it wasn't achieving the full potential benefits. So we also found a couple of other things about this. One was on maintenance. So we looked at a key problem in water is that a lot of infrastructure tends not to be very well maintained. And we looked at an approach of just providing some financing for the maintenance with the original well. Turned out that led to much better outcomes. So you shouldn't necessarily be thinking about a one-time investment. You should be thinking about the flow of services and how are you going to finance that flow of services. Another thing we found out was about willingness of people to walk for this. So when the spring was protected, people did walk a bit further to get the clean water. There's actually lots of springs in this area. It was only a little bit further. There wasn't that much extra willingness to walk to get cleaner water. So given these limitations of the infrastructure approach, we decided we'd try to look at another approach. Well, one other approach, which is pretty widely, it's being tried quite widely, is to provide home, what's called point-of-use water treatment with chlorine solution. So probably all of the water that we drink is chlorinated. Chlorination's an old technology, 100 years old. One nice thing about chlorine is it provides ongoing protection against contamination. So the water stays chlorinated for 24, 72 hours, depending on the exact composition of what's in the water exactly. There's a quite a number of randomized trials showing the health trials showing the impact of chlorine on diarrhea. Chlorine itself is incredibly cheap. If you go to the supermarket, buy a bottle of bleach, that has enough chlorine in it to treat 100,000 liters of water. I mean, it's very, very cheap. This product, it's called WaterGuard, sells for about 30 cents for a month's supply for a household. So that's pretty cheap. It's much more, the costs in there, the packaging costs and the distribution costs account for much, much more of that 30 cents than does the chlorine itself. You might think 30 cents doesn't sound like it's that much. The problem is there's pretty low take-up of this. It's been a big marketing campaign, but less than 10% of people are using it. That's still, I don't want to, there's still a lot of people using it. It's probably saved a lot of lives, but it's not saving as many lives as we need. It's not making enough of a dent in those 4,000 kids a day who are dying of diarrhea. So we started an iterative research process to try to examine the role of price, of taste. There's a faint taste of, initially there's a strong taste of chlorine. If you wait, the taste of chlorine fades, but is that the problem? Is it the messaging? We tried a bunch of different approaches, working with experts on psychology and economics from the emerging field of behavioral economics. Turned out that we got some quite consistent findings. So first, turns out that even that small price makes a huge difference. And that's something that's come up with all sorts of different health prevention behaviors, whether it's mosquito nets or immunization. Very small difference in incentives can have a huge impact on behavior. Convenience is also important. That's consistent with our finding that people would walk a bit further to get to one of these protected springs, but not very much further. If you have to go, when we gave out, so the taste is not an obstacle for most people in this area. If you gave out free WaterGuard, most people would use it. If you gave out coupons for free WaterGuard, people would use it for a while, but then they would stop using after a while. Just the hassle of going to the store and redeeming the coupon turned out to be a bit of an obstacle. Salience, making things sort of very obvious to people. This type of health behavior is very susceptible to habit formation. And if I think about myself, I should emphasize, a lot of these findings are very consistent with what we know about psychology of health behavior around the world. It's not just a developing country situation. I know I should be taking an aspirin every day. I don't, because I think one of the factors is I never got in the habit of doing this. I do brush my teeth every day, you'll be pleased to know. I was trained to be in the habit of that as a kid, and there's a certain time each day that I do it. So finding ways to make something a habit can be very important. It also seems to be subject to social effects. There's a famous study of do people wash their hands, and they actually this is a study in the developed world. They tried to record are people washing their hands in a public restroom. And the answer is they're much more likely to do that if somebody else is in the bathroom with them. So how can you take advantage of these findings about health behavior and think about this problem of child diarrhea and how to reduce it? Well, let me show you the system that together with other researchers at Harvard, in work supported in part by the Center for International Development, that we came up with. The approach was to have, instead of that small container with a lot of packaging, have a big container of chlorine at the site. Okay? That makes this much more cost effective. There's something that releases the right amount of chlorine from one of those 20-liter jerry cans. There's a local promoter because contact with somebody is important. They're only paid for 6 months, a couple of dollars. After that, we found that it's not necessary to keep them engaged. They just have to keep refilling the chlorine. And then bulk chlorine refills. Okay, so when we experimented with this approach, we found that take-up went from less than 10% to more than 50%, as verified by testing people's water in their household for chlorine. Self-reported chlorination is even higher, like 70%. And what was exciting to us was this wasn't just in the 3 months after the program was initiated and people were excited. We kept going back, and 2.5 years later, we still had the majority of people, found the majority of people were using this. Okay? If you look at the cost effectiveness of this, and you compare this to other approaches, this is extremely cost effective. Sort of close, if you spend $1,000, this is something that the Poverty Action Lab at MIT put together, comparing different approaches to reducing diarrhea, you avert close to 700 cases for spending $1,000. Okay, and that turns out to something like, the long-run cost of this would be something like $30, $35, $40 per year of life saved. Okay? So a question, and I think a key question when you take this from research to thinking about innovation and trying to affect the world, is how are you going to scale this and how are you going to sustain it? And the paradox here is, one of the things that we found out was essential to getting high take-up of this was to make it free. But if it's going to be free, then you have to come up with the financing somewhere. How are you going to do that? So that's a real challenge. We've explored two approaches. Or I say we. There's an NGO, Innovations for Poverty Action, which I'm helping advise, which is looking into how to scale this. So one approach, and the approach that they were initially focusing on, and remains an important part of their focus, is working with the public sector. And it turns out that politicians are, I'm not claiming that Kenyan politicians are saints in any way, but they want to get reelected. And one of the ways you get reelected is by providing services to your constituents. So it turns out that a number of local governments in Kenya have ordered dispensers and chlorine refills, and they've contracted out the provision of this to IPA. And Ministry of Education's done that as well, and foundations and other NGOs have gotten involved. There's now, I believe, about 200,000 people who have access to chlorine this way, and that'll, by the end of the year, that should be up to 300,000 by the end of the calendar year. So I think that's an approach that is definitely worth thinking about. It turns out in this particular context that there may be another approach, which in some ways may offer the potential for even more rapid scaling. It's through the private sector. Now, what's going on here? I just said that it's very hard to get people to pay for this. I think thinking more broadly about what the private sector means is worthwhile. If you think about the big companies, first, if you think about the big companies in the water sector, Vivendi and so on, they're not necessarily selling, they have contracts with municipalities, with governments. So that's one way. But the particular thing that may be promising in this case is through carbon credits. Because if people's water is dirty, what are other ways to deal with that? Well, the thing that's promoted most heavily in terms of, in Kenya and worldwide, in terms of advice to households, is boil your water. Not everybody does that. But it turns out that enough people do that. If they boil their water, they're boiling wood, they're boiling maize cobs. That releases, that's very bad for carbon, not just because of carbon emissions, but also because of some other chemicals, which have a very strong impact on the environment. It's also very bad for human health to be exposed to that indoor air pollution. The amount of carbon of emissions that can be avoided, or the amount that can be prevented from people who, the way the carbon credits rules work, you can get carbon credits not just for what people are already emitting, but for what they would emit if they had the resources to boil their water. Turns out that it looks like that's enough to more than pay for the cost of the chlorine resupply. So it looks, and in fact for the initial dispenser. So it looks like there may be a model here, and this is a hypothesis, something that we're going to have to be checking into, or trying to, we hope that we're exploring right now. But it may be possible that with purely private finance, you may be able to cover the full cost of this, and in fact have enough resources to expand the program and put it in other places, which would offer the opportunity to take this from something that's serving 300,000 people, which it will be at the end of the year, to something that could be serving, just within East Africa, 25 million people, something on that order. So that would be, that's our hope as to where this would go. So let me take this as an opportunity to segue a bit into the broader issue of, return to the issue of innovation and evidence. So chlorine dispensers are one example of something that's been proven to work with a rigorous evaluation, with a randomized trial, and that we're now working to scale up. Marcella mentioned the example of deworming. That was an example of something that was also found to work, and we worked to scale with the public sector. The Kenyan government treated 3.5 million kids. The government of Bihar just decided to do this. They implemented a program reaching 17 million kids, and this has been done more widely. So there are some successes. Obviously, for those of you who are familiar with the conditional cash transfers, is a huge success in this area, now being done in 30 countries. But there's a lot of cases where evidence has been developed, successful approaches have been developed, but they haven't yet been scaled. This is limited donor support. I don't just want to focus on this as something that can be done by donors, something that's done by the private sector, by governments of countries. When the administrator of USAID, Raj Shah, was appointed to his position, he contacted me and asked if I wanted to get involved in USAID in some way. And one of the things I told him was I thought one area where work needed to be done was to try to marry evidence and innovation. And that this is something that had the potential, where there were a lot of things that had already been demonstrated but hadn't been taken to scale. And there was a lot of room to apply these techniques to come up with innovative solutions to new problems. He suggested that I talk to Maura O'Neill, who will be speaking next. Maura has a background as an entrepreneur. You know, my background is as an academic. Maura's is as an entrepreneur. Maura is the senior counselor to the administrator of USAID and is chief innovation officer for USAID. So together we sat down and we tried to think about how can we design an institution that would fit within the USAID culture and that would also help change and deepen that culture and deepen the culture of work of evidence and of innovation, and support people outside the agency who are coming up with lots of fantastic ideas. And I guess what I'd like to do now is I'll stop talking and turn it over to Maura to say more.
So let me just add two things to Michael's, because I think that part of the issue is how do you get this research and evidence into practice immediately? So the first week that the administrator and I started at USAID was the Haiti earthquake. And so talk about trial by fire. But we knew of Michael's research, and we said, you know, one of the things we know about earthquakes is one thing always happens is diarrheal disease goes up because you have a lot of people and contaminated water, etc. And so an innovative contracts person at AID, when the water filtration equipment got grounded, it didn't get into Haiti 2 days after the earthquake, and we knew that people needed water, and they needed clean water if they were going to survive. We started trucking water over for the Dominican Republic. And so the really smart contracts person, we told him about Michael's research, and so on the fly he wrote into the contract that the driver would actually distribute chlorine tablets along with the water when they were going. Haiti, as a result of that innovative driver and Michael's research, we had 11% less diarrheal disease post the earthquake than before. That is simply a stunning development, because it usually never ever goes in that direction. So I think that the challenge for all of us is how do we take this great evidence and immediately start actualizing it. So we're excited. Another metric that I think will be interesting for those of you from a policy point of view, we've done a lot of analysis of the scale up of chlorine dispensers in Kenya and its opportunity. And we have analyzed that the capital expenses are about $1 per person, and the operating expenses are about 30 cents a person per year. So if you take 10 million Kenyans or 10 million East Africans, it's about $10 million, which is pretty modest to actually implement compared to any other alternative clean water, and about 30 million to provide that in operating expenses. But as Michael said, we had this notion that we wanted to institutionalize development innovation ventures. So we started with the notion, and I know this will shock and amaze you, that not all profound knowledge comes from inside USAID about development or its implementing partners. So we had a belief, fundamental belief, that innovation came from everywhere, and we wanted to create a mechanism that really did that. And so we said, well, who in the world really does that particularly well? And we said Silicon Valley, those folks are really smart at doing that. And how do they do it? They make a bunch of small little bets, and they see if those fish really swim. And then if they do, they feed them more food. If they don't, they let them die. And on and on and on. So we constructed the Development Innovation Ventures. It's 3 steps. The first is a proof of concept, and we said, bring us your proposals, less than 5 pages. Tell us why this matters, what development, how you're going to change the world with this outcome, and show us that even in your proof of concept, we are only about scale. So if you can't show us how this has the potential to reach tens of millions of people, it might be a terrific project, but we aren't interested in it. Okay, so that's stage 1, proof of concept. Stage 2 is, at that point, we want to, and that's about $100,000. So it's a small bet. Then we increase it and we say, well, we're willing to make the next double down, actually, in this case, 10x down. We're willing to bet $1 million if, in fact, you show that the proof of concept really is. But at that point, we want to see evidence. You know, as an entrepreneur, we're willing to go out there and wing it and not have evidence, but we actually can scale things. The nice collaboration with Michael is that economists and academics are excellent at evidence. So we said, how do we marry this? So that's stage 2, $1 million. Stage 3 is the scale up. At that point, we want you to scale, and we say that we would say 6 to 15 million. But we said also you can come in at any scale. If you've bootstrapped your way through stage 1 and you're ready for stage 2, then we'll do that. So I thought I'd just show you a couple. We did it, we cobbled together $1 million last year and tried with our first 8 to see if we would test out this concept. So this is one that some of you may have seen. It was the cover of Slate magazine, an article by Ray Fissman a couple days ago. This is election legitimacy through cellular technology. So this we spent only about $100,000, and in 450 polling sites in the Afghanistan election last September, half of them were not told anything, and half of the polling managers were told the night before that somebody is going to take a picture of the tally that's posted at the end of the day. So essentially, somebody's watching, somebody's going to be looking at what the vote count is and comparing it to the national roll-up. Because somehow, oftentimes, as you know, that changes somewhere along the way. That tally somehow miraculously gets changed. Well, if you look at the Slate article, you'll find that this identified 60% of the fraud in Afghanistan in the randomized polling sites, meaning that if the polling manager knew somebody was watching and knew that there was going to be a picture, there was 60% less fraud. What's not in that article, which you think is equally as important, is that it was then tested in Uganda in February, similar sorts of results, but they also did some qualitative analysis, and they said, how comfortable and confident do you feel in the integrity of your government? In the polling areas where there was less fraud, they actually felt that there was more. They also figured out is how much fraud is going on. You know, how much are they juicing or making up these numbers? And they found it was about 25%. So those are both. Now, listen, crooks are crooks, and so we don't believe that this will be a time-tested method forever, but we also think if we get smarter and better about scaling, using new technology that's inexpensive, you know, that it really matters. In Uganda, this technique cost a little over $100,000. We spent, as a world, $15 million on international monitors in Uganda. So the idea behind the Development Innovation Ventures is to really leverage new ideas that are way more cost-effective. This is a next one I'd like to tell you about, and this is a self-test for the early detection of the second most common reason moms die at birth. As many of you know, in the Millennium Development Goals, we are doing really poorly with respect to progress on moms dying and children dying. We just aren't doing very well. So it's an area in which we wanted to see a lot of innovation. So it turns out that a offshoot of Johns Hopkins, JPEGO, had developed what essentially put a test in what became a Sharpie. Now they're doing a roller ball. And women, semi-literate or literate women, semi-literate or illiterate women can do this test in their pregnancy themselves. The test in the U.S. cost about $1.50 at wholesale. they brought the cost down 97% to about 0.3 of a penny. So you had a test that was, as of now, not available to women around the world, and at 0.3 of a penny now becomes available. So this is in field trials, and they are negotiating with 2 manufacturers to actually manufacture and distribute this. And then I'll tell you one last one, and this is, I think, the iterative process that Michael talked about with respect to chlorine. And this is a hydrogen fuel cell. And this is the kind of new talent that we had hoped that this mechanism would attract. Michael Levenfeld, who actually invented this, when he was 19 at Washington University, he did the improvement for the oxygenator, the little clip-on that they put on your finger at a hospital to tell you how much oxygen's in your blood. So he developed the new and improved one at 19, sold the company, and I'm happy to say as an entrepreneur that he still gets a little tick out of it every time one of those are sold. In his mid-20s, he went to Columbia, developed another company. He's now the ripe old age of 30, and he's developed his 3rd company, of which this is the hydrogen fuel cell. He never thought about, before the Development Innovation Ventures, about figuring out whether he could adapt his technology to the development world. So this is a hydrogen fuel cell. In our phase 1, he actually had it on a bike, which is looking at, in developing countries, how they could bring their products to market more quickly. But now we're looking at a proposal where he's taking it as a off-site, off-grid portable power source, because what he knew about that is that you could use it to propel your bike, but when you got someplace, you could take that fuel cell off, you could plug your cell phone in, you could plug your refrigerator, you could plug a water filtration. So through the process of this phase 1, he said, the technology's working, it's great, but I actually identified the wrong market. The market that's probably more clearly here is the disaster recovery and the healthcare market. And so these are some of the numbers that he shared with this. So just to give you an idea, if you were using a standard cell phone, using this as a power source would cost you about 0.2 of a penny for every hour that you're talking. And if you know, it is simply stunning how much people in the developing world are paying per hour just to refresh their cell phone, not in terms of the minutes, but in terms of the electricity. And you go down and you see vaccine refrigeration. This is saying that using this is about 9 cents an hour for keeping vaccines safe. So then there's one last one, and that's empowering health workers using technology. This is an open platform on a cell phone that anybody can use. This is an ASHA, a community health worker in India, and she is going through a display-driven thing to ask questions for the woman who's pregnant. But the most important thing in this is that it has a module that you can translate any of the languages. So anybody who knows any language could use it to actually upload a language. So let's say I'm an ASHA in India, and I don't happen to know the language of the person that's coming in. By an open source APIs, thousands of languages can be loaded, so this app can be used, and that's what we are funding, is the development of that open app. So this is just a little sense of, this is a new mechanism. We're excited about it. We're doing one in Haiti. We're looking potentially for a countrywide application in Latin America, and so we just give you this as an example of ways that are useful to think about, how do we attract the best and the brightest brains around the world to come with out-of-the-box inventions and innovations in development that are tested and can scale to millions of people and are way more cost-effective than perhaps best practices today. So we're happy to give you, to dialogue with you about this, and we'd also encourage you in your network to have people who have these kinds of ideas to bring forward to us. We're doing our 4th round tomorrow. We will have, over the last year, invested in about 28 of these ideas that we're quite excited about. So with that, I'd like to say thank you and ask Asim up here with the panel.